The morning light came through the tall windows of Ashcroft House in long, pale bars, and Cecily stood at the top of the servants' stair in her wedding gown. She had not planned to wear it. She had opened the wardrobe at 7:30, still in her dressing wrapper, meaning to choose the gray wool traveling dress that was sensible and anonymous, and would cause no one to look twice. She had stood before the wardrobe for some time. Then she had looked at the wedding gown hanging in its cloth cover at the far end of the rail, and she had thought about the Marshalsea and about the warden's face when a woman arrived without title or visible means to demand anything at all, and she had understood that she could not afford to be sensible today. The gown was white silk, empire-waisted, with cream lace at the cuffs and the neckline. It had been made for her in 6 days by a modiste the Duke's household employed, and it fit well despite the speed. She had worn it once. She wore it now standing at the top of the servants' stair, with her long white gloves pulled to the elbow and the pearl-headed pin holding her hair in its knot, and she was aware that she looked like a woman who had walked out of a ceremony and not stopped. The folded letter was inside her stays, where she had carried it since the morning after her father died. She pressed her palm once to the place where it sat, and felt the small resistance of the paper through the silk. Then she descended the stair and went to find the carriage. The footman at the lower door, a young man named William who had not yet learned to arrange his face into the correct blankness, looked at her with naked alarm. "The Duke's carriage," she said. "At once, please." She had been the Duchess of Ashcroft for 3 weeks and 4 days. She was still learning what those words cost and what they purchased. She had been Miss Cecily Ward for 24 years before that, and for most of them she had lived quietly and well in a Shropshire house with a father who read Greek for pleasure and forgot to pay his creditors. The house had been beautiful. The library had been beautiful. The bills, she had eventually understood, had not been paid in some years. Her father, Mr. Rader. Edmund Ward had died in March, and the lawyers had come in April. And by May, it had become clear that the debts exceeded anything the Ward estate could satisfy. The entailment went to a distant cousin. The contents of the house would be sold. Miss Ward and her brother, Mr. Thomas Ward, were to be left with their personal possessions and approximately nothing else. Cecily had been 23 years old, with a good education, no money, and a younger brother who had not yet understood that the world was not obliged to find him as charming as their father had. Thomas was 21, and still at his late attempts at a legal career, reading in a chambers that paid him almost nothing, spending what he had on the social life that keeping up with colleagues required. She had not known then what Thomas's spending had produced. She had not known about the debt to Mr. Aldous Crane. The arrangement with the Duke of Ashcroft had come through a solicitor in June, and it had been explained to Cecily with the careful gentleness of men who expected her to weep. She had not wept. She had read the document twice and asked 3 questions, all practical. The Ward debts, the full sum, would be discharged. She would become the Duchess of Ashcroft. She would live in the Duke's household and be provided for according to her new station. The Duke required a wife. She was available. The terms were clear. She had told Thomas about it at a coffee house near his chambers, because she could not afford a private parlor. He had gone very pale and then very loud, and she had put her hand over his on the table. "It is done," she had said. "Do not make it worse by arguing." He had argued anyway for an hour, and then he had walked her to her lodging and kissed her forehead, and said he was sorry, and she had gone inside and sat for a while with the last letter their father had ever written her, which was dated 3 weeks before he died, and which said very little except that he was proud of her, and that she had always understood the things that mattered, and that he was glad she had her mother's steadiness. She had read it until she had stopped crying. Then she had put it inside her stays, where it had lived, ever since. The wedding had been in August, at the Ashcroft House Chapel, very small, with no guests beyond what the legal requirements demanded. The Duke had arrived on time. He had worn his navy coat with the brass buttons and a white cravat, and he had said the words in a clear, level voice without looking at her with anything she could read. He was 34 years old, and his face was the kind of face that had been handsome once, and had since become something more severe. all planes and precision with gray eyes that took inventory rather than invitation. Afterward, there had been a wedding breakfast to which Lady Dorothea Ashcroft had invited 12 people Cecily did not know, and Lady Dorothea had stood at the head of the table and managed the conversation with the smooth authority of a woman who had been managing this household for 8 years and did not intend to stop simply because a new Duchess had been installed. Cecily had sat in her white gown and eaten what was placed before her, and answered what was addressed to her, and listened to Lady Dorothea say aside to the housekeeper in a voice that was not quite soft enough, that she was a ward paid off, nothing more, and that they should not expect the household to require any significant adjustment. She had heard it. She had kept her face composed and reached for her water glass and let the remark settle into her like a stone dropped into still water. She had known when she read the document in June that this was the category the arrangement placed her in. She was not surprised to hear it said aloud. She had only not expected it on the wedding day itself. What she had not expected, on the wedding day or in the 3 weeks following, was Thomas. He had arrived at the Marshalsea 3 days before the wedding. The debt to Mr. Forst. Aldous Crane had been called in the same week the Ward estate sale was finalized. Whether out of opportunism or malice or simple commercial timing, she did not know, but the sum was £240, and Thomas had not had it. And the marriage settlement that had been so carefully arranged to discharge Edmund Ward's debts had discharged Edmund Ward's debts specifically and covered nothing Thomas had contracted on his own. The solicitor who handled the settlement had explained this to her, very gently at the wedding breakfast. She had listened. She had thanked him. She had gone back to her seat and eaten the rest of the meal. She had not told the Duke. She had not told the Duke because she did not yet understand what she was permitted to ask him, and because the arrangement had been clinical and procedural, and she did not know whether a brother in the Marshalsea fell under the category of things a ward paid off was permitted to raise. She had spent 3 weeks writing to solicitors who could not act without funds. She did not control. She had written to Mr. Crane's office twice, formally, as the Duchess of Ashcroft, requesting a meeting to discuss the terms of the debt. Mr. Crane's office had not replied. Thomas had been there for 25 days. If you have ever wondered what it means to carry a thing like that through a household that does not know you are carrying it, the answer is this. It means that your hands are always slightly colder than they should be, and that you find yourself counting days, and that when the Duke passes you in the corridor and says good morning with that precise, level courtesy that could mean anything at all, you say good morning in return and continue walking, and the thing you are carrying goes with you everywhere. The 3 weeks had not been without their texture. Cecily had learned the household by careful observation, the way she had always learned unfamiliar things, by attending to what was not said as much as what was. She had learned that Mrs. Forkins, the housekeeper, was capable of a loyalty that had not yet been directed anywhere in particular since Charlotte died, and that it was available if one did not press for it. She had learned that the Duke breakfasted alone and read correspondence until 10, and preferred the study at the front of the house because the light came in from the east and was good for reading. She had learned that his hands, which she had noticed at the wedding, were careful with things, cups and books and the leaves of documents, in a way that people who arrange their lives around efficiency are not always careful. She had been invited to a dinner in the second week. Lady Dorothea had arranged it, 14 people around the long table, and had spent much of the meal directing conversation, away from Cecily, with the smooth precision of a woman who has managed rooms for years. When a Mrs. Caldwell, the wife of a baronet from Hertfordshire, had turned to Cecily with genuine warmth to ask where she had been educated, Lady Dorothea had spoken first. "Miss Ward," she had said. The old address, again used smoothly, and apparently without awareness, was never quite in the first circle, but she reads very creditably. She had then added, directing herself to the baronet at her right, "One adjusts one's expectations." Mrs. Caldwell had looked uncertain. Cecily had eaten her soup. The Duke had looked up from his plate at that moment. She had not known what the look meant. She was still not certain what the look meant. The carriage rolled south through London in the early morning, and Cecily sat with her white skirts arranged around her and her gloved hands in her lap, and watched the streets change as they crossed the river into Southwark. She had visited the Marshalsea once before years ago with her father, who had been bringing books to a friend of his who had fallen into difficulty. She remembered the gate, the smell, the particular quality of the air inside the outer courtyard, which was not quite the air of the street outside. She remembered thinking that her father's friend had looked smaller than she had expected a man to look. The carriage stopped. William the footman opened the door and looked at her with that barely managed alarm again, and she stepped out into the street in her wedding gown and walked through the Marshalsea gate. She had thought about what she would say. She had the letter from her solicitor, naming her title and her connection to the ward debt settlement. She had prepared a clear account of what she was asking for and why the Duke's household could be considered responsible for the extension. What she had not prepared for was Mr. Aldous Crane, who was apparently in conference with the warden at exactly that hour, and who appeared at the warden's door at the moment she was explaining her purpose, and who looked at her, at the gown, at the gloves, at the pearl pin, and said, in a voice arranged for the warden's benefit, "The debt is not the Duchess's affair. A ward paid off should stay paid." She felt the words land. She stood very straight. "You have not yet replied to my letters," she said. "I thought it more efficient to come in person." Mr. Crane was a man of 50, with small eyes and a precision in his dress that suggested he found satisfaction in technical dominance of any kind. He looked at her the way a man looks at something he has decided is a complication rather than a person. "The debt is valid," he said. "The debtor is in the correct place. The Duchess's title does not affect the arithmetic." "No," she said. "But the Duke of Ashcroft's bond would, which I am here to offer." She had not, in point of fact, asked the Duke of Ashcroft for his bond. She did not have the Duke of Ashcroft's authorization to offer his bond. She had, in the 3 weeks of her marriage, learned a certain number of things about what it meant to be a duchess, and one of them was that the title carried weight in rooms like this one, even when the authority behind it was technically uncertain, because very few wardens or creditors were willing to bet that they were reading the situation correctly. She was offering the Duke's bond, the way one offers a card whose face value has not been confirmed, and is counting on no one at the table to call the bluff. The warden was looking at Mr. Crane. Mr. Crane was looking at Cecily. She did not look away. What happened next happened in a doorway that Cecily did not know was occupied. Julian Ashcroft had been told by William the footman, stammering and apologetic and obviously terrified, that the Duchess had taken the carriage. He had been told this because William was young enough to still believe that the right person to tell was the Duke. And the Duke was already dressed and in his study by 8:30, and the footman had appeared in the doorway with the look of a man delivering news he was not sure he would survive. Julian had listened. He had said, "Which direction?" and put on his coat and gone out. He had taken the smaller carriage and he had arrived at the Marshalsea gate in time to see his wife walk through it ahead of him, and something about the set of her back, in the white gown, very straight, moving without hurry, as if she had every right to be exactly where she was, had made him stop just inside the gate rather than follow. He did not know why he stopped. He stood in the outer courtyard with the gate behind him and watched through the gap in the warden's door, as his wife stood before a man he recognized, Crane, of Crane and Briggs, a solicitor he had dealt with, on small property matters and a man of sharp leverage and small satisfactions. He had not in 3 weeks of marriage heard his wife's voice carry that particular quality. He had heard her speak at breakfast, carefully. He had heard her answer Lady Dorothea's pointed conversational gambits with a composed directness that he had noted and then filed away. He had looked at her across the dining table on 17 separate occasions and found something specific in her face that he had not permitted himself to name. He stood in the doorway of the Marshalsea and watched her bluff with his name, and something in his chest shifted in a way he did not have a current word for, because the last time he had felt anything shift in his chest, it had been in the Ashcroft townhouse in London on a February night 8 years ago. And what he had felt then was the floor going out from under him, and what he had felt for 8 years since was the absence of any floor at all. He had married Charlotte Mabry when he was 26 and she was 22. And he had believed in the simple, uncomplicated way of young men who have not yet been educated by loss, that people you loved remained in the world as long as you needed them. Charlotte had been brilliant and warm and had laughed easily, and he had not understood that he was not protecting her by being capable and efficient and always in motion. He had been at Ashcroft Park in dispute with a neighboring estate over a water right when the message came that Charlotte was in early labor. He had ridden through the night. He had arrived in the morning. The house had been very quiet. He had told himself, over the 8 years since, that the lesson was about self-sufficiency. That the efficient arrangement of one's affairs so that feeling did not produce exposure was the only correct response to the world's demonstration of what feeling cost. He had believed this firmly enough to arrange a marriage with a woman he did not know, because the practical terms were legible and the emotional stakes were nil. And he had spent 3 weeks proving to himself that nothing had changed. And yet, he had looked up from his plate at Lady Dorothea's dinner on the evening of the 14th day of his marriage, and caught his wife's face in the moment after his aunt had spoken the old address. Cecily had not flinched. She had not colored. She had lowered her spoon and lifted it again, and her profile across the table was entirely composed, and only someone attending very specifically to her right hand would have noticed that it had been resting on the tablecloth and had moved to her lap in the half-second after the words landed. He had noticed. He had returned to his plate and eaten the rest of the course in a frame of mind he had not permitted himself in some years. He had also noticed on the morning of the 17th day that she had gone into the study library when she thought herself alone, and had stood for a long time in front of the shelves with the Greek texts, running one finger along the spines without pulling any of them out. He had seen this from the doorway. She had not seen him. He had walked away. He stood in the doorway and watched his wife stand straight, in her white gown before Crane's small assessing eyes. And he thought, she has been doing this for 25 days. And she did not ask me. She had not asked him because she did not know if she was permitted to. He turned and walked back through the Marshalsea gate. He found Crane's office address in his study, which contained all the relevant papers in ordered files. Because Julian Ashcroft had arranged his life so that everything could be found without assistance, he sent a note by express. He received a reply within the hour. The sum was £240. He dispatched his man of business with a bank draft before noon. He did not tell Cecily. He thought about telling her. He thought about it while she was at the Marshalsea, still in her white gown, apparently still negotiating with the warden, because the ducal carriage returned to Ashcroft House without her, and 2 hours passed before she arrived in a hackney coach that William, the footman, paid for at the door. Julian heard her come in from his study. He heard her go up the stairs. He heard, distantly, the sound of her door. He sat with his accounting book open before him, and did not turn a page for 20 minutes. There was a portrait of Charlotte in the upstairs gallery. He had not taken it down, because taking it down would have been an acknowledgment that required more interior negotiation than he had been willing to conduct. And so it remained, and he passed it every morning on the way to his dressing room and had stopped seeing it in the way that one stops seeing the things one cannot afford to see. He was thinking about it now, for reasons he could not explain with the same accounting logic he applied to everything else. He was thinking about the miniature in his breast pocket, which he did not take out, and about the expression on Charlotte's painted face, which had been warm and open and entirely unguarded in the way of someone who did not yet know what the world could cost. Cecily was not Charlotte. He had not been looking for Charlotte. He had not thought he was looking for anything at all. There was a quality in his wife's composure that he was beginning to understand was not coldness, and not blankness, and not the flat performance of a woman fulfilling a contractual arrangement. It was something he had not had a word for until this morning, when he had seen her stand still under a small man's contempt, in a debtor's prison in her wedding gown, and not give an inch. Her father had given her that. The man she described as not very good with money, who had been very good with knowing what he was. Julian sat with his accounting book, and the question of what he was. This was the state of the household when Lady Dorothea arrived for her customary afternoon call, and discovered from the housekeeper where the Duchess had spent her morning. Lady Dorothea Ashcroft had managed Julian's household since Charlotte died. She had arranged the dinners and the correspondence and the seasonal movements between the country and the city, and she had done all of this with a capable angular efficiency that had served Julian well, and that she had found deeply satisfying in the way that competent people find deeply satisfying the work that only they can do. She had arranged the terms of the marriage with Cecily with much the same care. She applied to everything, identifying a candidate who was sufficiently educated to be presentable, sufficiently constrained to be grateful, and sufficiently without other options to be compliant. She had not expected Cecily to be what Cecily was. She had expected a ward paid off, biddable and quiet. She had found over 3 weeks something that did not precisely biddable feel to her. It had not yet risen to the level of a problem. She had decided it would not. She swept into the drawing-room with Julian already present, and she sat. And she arranged her charcoal silk skirts, and she set her closed ivory fan on the arm of the chair. And she said, "I understand the Duchess went to the Marshalsea this morning." Julian said nothing. In her wedding gown, Lady Dorothea added, "To negotiate on behalf of her brother, apparently. Using your bond as a bargaining instrument without your authorization." Julian said nothing. "The warden sent a note," Lady Dorothea said. "He was uncertain of the legal standing. As well he might be, since the Duchess has no authority over your finances." The door to the drawing-room opened, and Cecily came in. She had changed out of the wedding gown. She was wearing the gray wool dress now, the one she had meant to wear that morning. Her hair had been redone more simply. She looked composed, which meant she had been composing herself for the 20 minutes it had taken her to hear that Lady Dorothea was in the drawing-room, and to understand that the note had been sent. The conversation had begun without her. She had come home in the hackney coach with her white skirts folded over her arm and her gloves pulled off and her hair beginning to come down from the pearl pin. And she had gone up the back stair so as not to be seen in the entrance hall, and she had stood in her room for a moment, with the wedding gown over a chair before her, and thought about Thomas. About his face when she had glimpsed him through the warden's office door, thin and pale and with his collar wrong. She had not been permitted to see him. The warden had not, in the end, agreed to anything. She had left the Marshalsea with the Duke's bond unoffered and Mr. Crane's debt intact, and Thomas still in his room. She had sat in the hackney coach on the way back, and looked at her hands in her lap, and understood that the bluff had not worked, and that she had no other plan. She looked at Julian. He was sitting in the tall chair near the window with his accounting book closed on the table beside him, and his face was the precise, unreadable thing it was in the mornings, across the breakfast table. And she could not determine from it whether he knew what she had done and was angry, or whether he was about to hear it and be angry, or whether the blankness meant something else entirely. She had been trying to determine that for 3 weeks. Lady Dorothea looked at her the way she had looked at her, at the wedding breakfast, the same measuring quality, the tilt of the head. "Miss Ward," she said, the old title coming out with a smoothness that was clearly not accidental. "We were just discussing this morning's adventure." Cecily stood still. "I understand the impulse," Lady Dorothea said, her tone arranged to be not quite unkind, "and no doubt the attachment to your brother is genuine. But you must see that what you have done is use my nephew's name and credit without his knowledge. In a debtor's prison, in a garment that has attracted attention from half of Southwark. And the consequences for the Ashcroft name and for your position in this household are not negligible." She paused, picked up the ivory fan, set it down again. "I would suggest that you write to Mr. Crane's office this afternoon withdrawing any representation you may have made about the Duke's bond. And I would suggest that you confine yourself to the house for the next few weeks while the gossip settles. It is the only reasonable course." The room was very quiet. Cecily looked at Julian. He was looking at his accounting book. He did not look up. She understood what his silence meant. Not because she was wrong about him, for she did not yet know him well enough to be certain of what he meant, But because this was the category of silence she had encountered before, in solicitors' offices, in the letters that did not reply, in the rooms of men who found the correct path was the one that cost them nothing. She understood what she was inside the arrangement. She had known since June. She thought about the letter inside her stays. She had not been carrying it today when she went to the Marshalsea, because she had changed her dress and transferred it to the gray wool before she came downstairs. And it sat against her now, that small folded paper. And she thought of her father's handwriting, and she thought of Thomas's face, which she had not yet been permitted to see. She thought of it plainly. This was the point at which you became what they said you were, or the point at which you did not. "I will leave you," she said. Her voice was level. "I am sorry for the difficulty." She turned toward the door. Julian stood up. She heard the sound of it, the chair, and then the precise sound of his feet on the floor, unhurried, deliberate, and she stopped. "Her brother's debt is discharged," he said. "The matter is settled." She turned. He was standing beside the chair with his hands at his sides, and he was looking at Lady Dorothea, and the quality of his gaze, that gray inventory quality, had shifted into something she had not seen before. It was not cold. It was what came after cold when the ice has moved and revealed the water under it. "I sent my man of business this morning," he said, still looking at Lady Dorothea. "The full sum, £240. The release will be processed today." He paused. "Mr. Thomas Ward will be at liberty by this evening." Lady Dorothea stared at him. Her hand was on the ivory fan. She was not tapping it. "You authorized," she began and stopped. "I did not require authorization," he said, and his voice had that level authority that she had once thought was coldness, and now heard as something else. "For a matter concerning my wife's family." The room held still for one full breath. Lady Dorothea's composure did not collapse. She was too capable for that. Something in her face rearranged itself, like a room whose furniture has been moved slightly in the night, and she looked between Julian and Cecily with a calculation that Cecily recognized as a woman recalibrating quickly what she had decided she knew. "I see," Lady Dorothea said. She stood and she smoothed her charcoal silk and she picked up the ivory fan. And she said, with a formality that was not warmth, but was not contempt either, "I was not aware of the full circumstances." "No," Julian said simply. Lady Dorothea inclined her head. She looked at Cecily. The look was not an apology. It was a recognition brief and measured, the kind that acknowledges miscalculation without quite admitting it, and then she moved past them both and left the room, and Cecily heard her footsteps in the hall and then the soft sound of the front door. The drawing room was quiet. Julian stood near the window with the afternoon light on the side of his face, and Cecily stood near the door, and the sound of Lady Dorothea's footsteps faded along the hall, and then the front door closed, and the house was still. Cecily did not move immediately. She was standing with one hand on the door frame, which she had not intended, which her body had apparently found necessary, and she was looking at Julian's back as he stood facing the window. And she was trying to do the arithmetic again, the same arithmetic she had been doing all afternoon. And, finding that it did not resolve in any of the directions she was accustomed to expecting from arithmetic, he had sent his man of business before the note arrived. She did not know yet when exactly he had left the Marshalsea, or at what point his man had gone to Crane, or whether he had decided before he arrived at the gate, or after he had stood in the doorway and watched. These were things she did not know, and was not certain she had the right to ask. What she did know was that Thomas's debt was discharged, and the matter was settled, and he had said so in front of Lady Dorothea, using the words his wife's family as if they were not complicated, as if they were simply true. She was not going to cry. She was quite certain of this. She pressed her palm once to the letter through the gray wool and looked at his back in the afternoon light. Julian stood near the window with the afternoon light on the side of his face, and Cecily stood near the door, and for a moment neither of them spoke. "You were at the Marshalsea," she said. It was not a question. "Yes." You saw, yes. She looked at him. She was trying to understand the arithmetic of the morning, what he had seen, what he had done, and in what order, and whether his man of business had gone before or after the note from the warden arrived, because the answer to that question mattered more than she could quite account for yet. Before the note, she said. He looked at her, then the gray eyes with their stillness and their grief, and something else that had not been there 3 weeks ago. Before the note, he confirmed. She stood with this for a moment. Why? She said. He considered the question with the same care he apparently applied to everything. Because you should not have had to go, he said. And because you went anyway. And because I should have asked. The light moved. Somewhere in the house a door opened, and then shut. Outside the window, a cart was passing in the street. Thomas arrived at Ashcroft House at 7 o'clock in the evening, thin and pale and disheveled, and with the look of a young man who has spent 25 days in a small room and has come out the other side of it knowing several things he did not know going in. Mrs. Parkins, who had been the housekeeper at Ashcroft House since the previous decade, and who had watched the last 3 weeks with the quiet attention of a woman who missed very little, brought him to the small sitting room where Cecily was waiting, and then found reason to be in the corridor. Cecily held her brother for a long time without speaking. When she let go, his eyes were red and so were hers, and he looked around the room with the careful look of a young man in a house that is not his own, and said, in a voice that was not quite steady, "Cecily, you went to the Marshalsea in your wedding gown. It seemed useful to look authoritative," she said. He laughed, which was the sound she had needed most, and she felt something that had been clenched hard in her chest for 25 days release, not all at once but gradually, the way cold air comes back to room temperature. They talked for 2 hours. She told him what had happened, simply and without embellishment. He told her what 25 days in the Marshalsea had been. He ate 2 plates of whatever Mrs. Barr has. Porkins brought without appearing to notice what it was, and by the end of the evening he looked like himself again, which was more than she had let herself hope for in some weeks. He went to bed in the guest room on the 2nd floor, the one with the blue hangings, because Julian had told the housekeeper that Mr. Cumbers Ward was welcome to stay as long as he needed, which was the kind of thing he had said without ceremony in passing, and which Cecily had heard and not known quite what to do with. She sat for a while in the small sitting room after Thomas had gone up, in the lamplight, and then she took the letter out of her stays and unfolded it on her knee. Her father's handwriting was uneven at the end, the letters larger than they had been in his better years, the pen pressure variable. She had read it so many times that she knew the words without looking. She looked anyway. She was still looking at it when there was a knock at the door. It was Julian. He did not come in, only stood in the doorway with his coat still on and his hands at his sides, and looked at her, and then at the letter on her knee. "I disturb you," he said. "No," she said. He stood in the doorway for a moment. Then he said, "I have been wanting to ask you something." She waited. "In the Marshalsea," he said. "When Crane said what he said, you did not move." "No," she said. "How did you learn to do that?" he said. It was not quite the question she had expected, and it was not asked with the polished social curiosity she had seen him use at dinners. It was quieter than that. It sounded, she thought, like something he had been carrying for a while. "My father," she said. "He used to say that the only things that can stand still under pressure are the ones that know what they are." She paused. "He was not very good with money. He was very good with knowing what he was." Julian's eyes moved to the letter. "Is that from him?" he said. "Yes." A pause. "He wrote it 3 weeks before he died," she said. "He said he was proud of me. He said I had my mother's steadiness." She smoothed the paper on her knee. "I've carried it since the morning after the funeral." Julian was quiet. He was looking at the letter, and then at her face, and she thought she saw something in his expression that she recognized from other faces, in other losses, a specific quality of understanding that belongs only to people who have also carried something they cannot put down. "May I come in?" he said. She moved the letter from her knee. Yes, she said. He sat in the chair across from her, and the lamplight was warm between them. And outside the window of Ashcroft House the September dark had settled over the street with the early quiet of a city going to bed, and the first rain of the evening had begun to come down against the glass, soft and steady. She showed him one line of the letter. Not all of it. One line. He read it without taking the paper from her. He was close enough to read it where it sat in her hand, and she was aware of that closeness with the same quiet awareness she had been carrying for 3 weeks, a warmth at her collarbone, a particular attention to the exact distance between them that was not quite measurable and not quite avoidable. He looked up from the letter and found her looking at him. For a moment neither of them moved. Then he said very quietly, "I have something to show you as well. Not tonight, but soon." She thought of the breast pocket of the navy coat, where she had once seen his hand rest for a moment during a long evening dinner, and then move away. "Whenever you wish," she said. The rain came down against the glass, and the lamp held steady, and Thomas slept upstairs in the blue room, and Cecily Ward, who was the Duchess of Ashcroft, and who had learned what that cost and what it purchased and what it might, in time, become, 90 and in the small sitting room of her new house, and listened to the rain and understood that the letter in her hands was no longer the only thing she was carrying. She had her mother's steadiness. She was going to need it. And she was, for the first time in 25 days, not sorry about that. If this story stayed with you, leave a thought in the comments. These small moments of quiet courage deserve to be witnessed. The lamp burned a little lower. The rain ran down the glass. Outside, London settled into its own evening, and inside the house, on the square, 2 people sat without speaking, while the silence between them changed into something that had not been there before, and learned, slowly, to hold the weight of what came next.